Hi, I'm Dr. Josh Simon, and thank you for taking this course on basic bone healing. In the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to be talking about how bone heals, what it's made of, what are the components, and everything you'd need to know in order to get started with further research on bone healing. You may be someone who has just broken a bone and is curious about what happens right now in your own body, or you could be a physician or somebody else working in the medical field that just needs to bone up on your knowledge, or maybe you just need this knowledge in order to get started in further study. Either way, this is going to be helpful for you. So let's get started. Now, I'm calling this course Basic Bone Healing, but before you actually get into how bone heals, there are a few other things you need to know before that. So we're going to really start out by talking about the purposes that bone serves. It's not just there to prevent you from turning into a big sack of goo. And then we're going to talk about what bone is made of. Bone is actually a living tissue. It's not just a big hunk of mineral. And then, of course, at the end, we'll get down to the nitty-gritty of how bone heals and what happens when you break one. Okay, so we all know what bones are, and we all know that bones give us support, they give us shape, they prevent our internal organs from getting damaged. But what else do? You may not realize that a lot of the cells in your blood come from bone. So bone has the storage of white blood cells and red blood cells. All of their ancestors and predecessors are stored there in your marrow spaces. So in a lot of those hollow parts of the bone, there's activity going on. There's cells that are in there maturing and then getting released into the blood to act as blood cells. So when you lose blood, if a blood cell dies from age or because you lost it, you bled, then it has to get replaced somehow, right? So all of your blood cells continually are turning over throughout your lifetime. The blood you have now is not the same blood that you had years ago. Where does that come from? Again, it comes from the insides of the bone. When I was in engineering school, I had a great teacher in physiology. I took the physiology courses that the regular physicians take in the medical school. And this guy knew he wasn't teaching just physicians, he was teaching engineers, so he had a very unique perspective in this particular course that he taught. He wanted us to understand how systems of the body all interacted. So his test questions, for example, would have been something like, tell me how your skeletal system affects your cardiovascular system. And you don't normally think of that, right? How does the heart affect the bones, or how do the bones affect the heart? And in fact, they do. Every system in your body can be affected by every other system. And particularly, it's a powerful connection between the bones and the heart. How is that? So the heart uses electrical activity to beat. And the nerves on the heart are electrically active because ions, charged atoms, and charged molecules can flow through the cell membranes, producing an electric current that propagates throughout the heart and causes the heart to beat ultimately. Well, some of these charged ions, these charged atoms, are calcium. And the calcium ions, which your heart requires on for keeping up its heartbeat, are very important, and they circulate in the blood. Where does the calcium in the blood come from? It comes from the bone. So if you don't have enough calcium in your blood, your heart can actually stop if it really goes too low. And your body prevents that by taking calcium out of your bones to keep the calcium in your blood levels high, the calcium levels in your blood high enough to keep the heart beating. By the same token, you can also have too much calcium in your blood. Maybe you're eating a lot of ice cream or drinking a lot of milk. And in that case, what would happen is that it can act in reverse. So the bones can start taking calcium out of the blood and making more bone with it. It's storing the calcium in bone that it's making. So the blood, the heart, and the bones are all very, very connected. Each one relies on each other. And if one goes down, all the other ones could go down as well. So the bone has a lot of purposes besides just protection and keeping us supported and shaped, all right? It produces blood cells, and it regulates calcium levels. So if you need to see what I just said written down, here it is, okay? Bone gives you a framework of support. It protects your internal organs. It spawns new red and white bone cells from the red bone marrow, and it regulates the calcium levels in your blood. So what is bone made out of? In actuality, the most common part of bone is called collagen, and it's not hard. It's a protein. It's soft. Collagen is the protein that makes up most of you, in fact. It's the most common protein in the human body, and there's many different kinds of collagen, but in particular in bone, we have what's called type 1 collagen. Now, the hard stuff is properly referred to as hydroxyapatite. It's made mostly out of calcium, so here's where your calcium is, but it also contains phosphate and hydroxyl groups. And then there are other proteins in the bone that are not collagen. And these proteins can be active. They help the bone form, or they even help it stop forming, depending on what protein there are. And then there's these other molecules in there called proteoglycans. And proteoglycans are interesting because they are mainly built to attract and keep water. So cartilage has a lot of water in it, a lot more than bone. And cartilage has a lot more proteoglycans in it, but bone does have some. And of course, because they are attracting water, you have water as another ingredient to bone. So bone has a lot of different substances, a lot of different kinds of molecules within it. Something else people don't realize about bone is that it's a living tissue. It's not just a dead hunk of stuff. Living tissues have blood vessels in them. Every cell in your body is no more than 1 or 2 cell spaces away from a blood vessel, from a capillary, with the exception of cartilage. This is because every cell in your body needs oxygen, and oxygen needs to diffuse out of the blood vessels and over to the cell. And if the cell is too far away from the blood vessel, it can't get enough oxygen and it suffocates. So bone is no exception to this. All the cells within bone, and there are cells within bone that we'll learn about, have access to blood vessels, which is where they get their oxygen. Lymphatic vessels are also in there. The lymph vessels take up the extra water that doesn't go back into the blood vessels when it's circulating through your body. And those lymphatic vessels will then take that water and circulate it way back up to your heart and dump it back into your blood system so you don't dehydrate yourself and your blood doesn't run out of liquid, basically. And of course, surrounding the bone, there's a lot of nerve tissue, a lot of nerve endings. This is why it hurts a lot if you've ever broken a bone, and you would know it. So within a piece of bone, there's a couple different types of bone, and we're going to talk about them on the next slide a lot, but I just want to call them out here. There's compact bone, which has other names like cortical bone, and then there's spongy bone, which can also be called cancellous bone. These things are organized into certain units depending whether it's compact bone or spongy bone, and I'm going to show you the difference right now. Okay, so as you watch me draw here, you're going to see why I've been failing art classes since kindergarten, but it's going to give you a basic idea. So we're going to just look at a bone here, and I'm just going to draw a dog bone sample here, real cheesy. Okay, and then I'm going to show you that if I take a cross section right here, I cut it right there, what I now have is a circle. All right, now you've seen a cross section of bone perhaps before. You see there's kind of this outer layer, is like a shell that goes all around it, and then there's a inner layer of another kind of bone. Okay, here's your compact spongy bone, and then there's a hole in the middle. All right, and that hole in the middle is generally where the marrow is. Okay, so to orient you here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a spot right here where this square is, and I'm going to zoom in and just look at that. All right, so if I just look at this spot here, what I would see is that there are all of these circles inside of it. And they may or may not line up. Usually they line up pretty good, but not always. And these circles are called osteons. All right. And the osteon is the unit, the smallest unit of bone. If I take one osteon and I zoom in on that, what I will then have is this. There's going to be another hole in the middle. All right, and that hole is called the Haversian canal. That's where the blood vessel goes through. And then you're going to see a lot of concentric circles. And in these concentric circles, you're going to see a lot of these little dots. You're going to see divots all along the area in every one of these concentric circles. And they're not going to be in any particular order. They're just going to be lots of divots there. And these little divots are called lacunae. And the lacunae are where the bone cells reside. In particular, the bone cells that reside in these lacunae are called osteocytes. Lacuna is the Latin word for crib, so you can kind of think of it like a crib holding a baby. And if you look inside of the bone even further, you're going to see, oh, it looks like a lot of little cracks emanating out from these lacunae. They go all over the place, and they connect to other lacunae. All right, and those cracks, they're going to go all throughout this whole structure. I'm just drawing a few here. Those are called caniculi, or canals. Caniculi. So caniculi can hold a little bit of liquid in them, and the cells, the osteocytes, will put little arms down there, little pseudopods down throughout all the caniculi, and they'll touch each other. So this guy right here might send out caniculi and touch this guy right here. And it's thought that this is how bones maintain their response to stress. There's something called Wolff's Law that says if bone gets stressed, it gets thicker. And if bone doesn't get stressed, it starts to go away. This is why astronauts in space come down with bones of 80-year-old people, because they're not stressing their bones when there's no gravity. And therefore the bones start to resorb. They start to just basically disappear. And it's thought that the signals that tell bone to do this or not go through these little caniculi. It's the osteocytes can talk to each other by sending chemicals through these little caniculi and by putting their pseudopods down there and touching each other and ticking off each other's receptors. All right, so you have, again, you have the Haversian canal, you have the lacunae, and you have the caniculi. I'm going to show you this in a better diagram in a future slide. But that's the basic structure of cortical bone. It's also called lamellar bone. Okay, so now we can run quickly through this, all right? This is the long bone structure up here. You can see that blood vessels go into it from the sides. This is where all the blood vessels eventually wind up in the Haversian canals. All right, you can see in this way that it's cut up here that you have your compact bone or cortical bone here and your cancellous or spongy bone here. And then here is where you do that zoom in. Okay, you have one osteon coming out here, and the osteon, if you look inside of it, it's really hard to see on this part of the slide, but that would be a lacuna. And you can see some of the canicula if you look really closely. Here is your Haversian canal where the blood vessels are. These are the ones that connect to the ones out here. There's also a layer I didn't mention in the last slide called the periosteum. The periosteum is a soft skin that's around the outside of the bone, and that's also a source of many different kinds of cells that ultimately become bone cells. So this is just a way better drawing, but I thought a whiteboard might help because it wouldn't just kind of throw it all at once. For the cortical bone structure, you can see it again here. This one you can sort of see the lacunae a little better. You can see all the little holes that are all around. All right, and then you can see the caniculi radiating. You can see them connecting the lacunae together. You can see it on the diagram here where the lamellae are the names of the concentric circles that they give within a single osteon. All right, here's the periosteum on the outside of the bone. So again, it's just two ways to look at this. There's also canals that cross this way between the Haversian canals themselves, and it's called a Volkmann's canal. I wouldn't have been able to draw that the way I had the cross section in the last one. You really need this 3/4 view for that. So that's the basic structure of cortical bone. The cancellous bone is set up a little bit differently, and we'll show you some slides of that. Okay, but first I want to take some time and now go over the different kinds of bone cells. We talked a lot about osteocytes, which appeared just before. These are the cells that get trapped in the lacunae, but what they really are is a mature form of something called an osteoblast. Osteoblasts are your basic bone-forming cells. They can crawl around, they can make bone as they go along behind them, and they pretty much just do that, and they're very, very common in cancellous bone, which we're going to look at in a moment. Osteoclasts are the opposite. Osteoclasts take bone away. They resemble white blood cells, which are called macrophages, in that they both have multiple cell nuclei. Most cells only have one nucleus, and that's kind of like the brain center of the cell. But osteoclasts have multiple nuclei per cell, and they are primarily responsible for resorbing or taking bone away. So this is what's called a histology slide. This is where you slice a very thin piece of bone, or any tissue really for that matter, and you treat it in certain kinds of solutions, and it's sliced so thin that you can then put it on top of a microscope slide and stain it, or you can stain it and then put it on top of a microscope slide. It all depends. And in this particular kind of stain that they're using, all of the hard bone tissue is stained green. So all the green stuff you see in this slide is hard bone, mineralized bone. And everything that's not hard bone in this particular kind of staining system stains like an orangish yellow. So there's a lot going on here that you can see. So I've labeled the bone. You can see it right here. Now, the orange here, if I outline it, that you're looking at is an osteoclast. Remember I said on the last slide, osteoclasts are the bone removing or the bone resorbing cells. You can see this is an osteoclast because the dead giveaway is it has a ton of nuclei in the cell. This is all one cell with multiple nuclei in it, as opposed to other bone cells you see out here, which only have one nuclei in it. There actually aren't a whole lot of them around in this particular slide. There's a lot of osteoclasts. This is a very angry slide. But down here you see a lot of single nuclei cells. Now an osteoclast has a dead giveaway. It creates something in a bone called a resorption pit. So you can see that right here. This is where you know that an osteoclast was just at work. These sharp edges that are being made around the bone, sharp edge right there, okay, all these sharp edges. Bone should be smooth if it's growing and healing, but if it's being taken away, if it's being resorbed, it gets a lot of these sharp edges. That's what the osteoclasts do. They go in and they use like an acid, almost it is hydrochloric acid, and they start taking away the mineral there and leaving behind the soft stuff, which is also gradually going to be going away. Now here's a happier scenario where things are growing and not being destroyed. You can see a resorption pit on this side. That was where the bone was previously being worn away and resorbed by a osteoclast, although the edge here is not as sharp. And on the other side, you can see there's this layer of orange on top of the bone. All right, there's layer. And all these little cells in the layer are single nuclei. They have a single nucleus each. And they are osteoblasts. So I've labeled those here. So these osteoblasts are laying down a soft tissue, a soft precursor to bone, all in here. And that is called osteoid. Osteoid is bone that has not been hardened yet. So the mineral has yet to go in there and form crystals to make it complete. But the osteoid is what's going to set that up. So the osteoblasts go in there and they lay down this osteoid, and then all the minerals floating around, both inside the osteoblast and outside of the bone, will start to mineralize that osteoid, and then it'll look green like the rest of the bone. Occasionally, a single osteoblast may get trapped in there, and then you get a guy like this who is trapped, and he becomes an osteocyte. So an osteocyte is an osteoblast that got trapped as the bone was being mineralized. Okay, so we've completed the tutorial on what bone is, what it's made out of, what kind of cells are in it, and now we're going to look at when things go wrong. We're going to look at what happens when bone breaks. So there's two kinds of bone healing mechanisms, and they both have really long, really complicated names. One is called endochondral ossification, and the other is called intramembranous bone formation, or intramembranous formation. I actually wrote them up here backwards because I'm going to go over them from back to front. This here is what we also refer to as secondary bone healing, and this down here is what we call primary bone healing. I reversed them because secondary bone healing is actually much more common. It's much more what you think about when you think of bone healing. And then primary bone healing happens, but it happens only under certain circumstances. Okay, so you have a bone. And we're going to talk about secondary bone healing, endochondral ossification. So you fracture this bone, bang. All right, not a good day, but what happens? The first thing that happens whenever you break a tissue inside your body is it bleeds. And the fancy medical term for bleeding and forming a scab is called a hematoma. So a hematoma is basically a scab. You're going to form a scab in this area here, and that's going to attract cells to the area. So cells are going to come in. White blood cells are going to come in. They're going to look for invaders. They're going to look for anything that has to be cleaned up. Osteoclasts are going to come in. They're going to start eating up all the sharp edges to prevent any more sharp edges from being around. They're going to start eating up any free pieces of bone or chunks of bone that got knocked off in the process. They're basically going to come in there and clean that up. And you're going to get a tremendous inflammation. You know, the first stage of any wound healing is inflammation, and that coincides with this as well. So that's where everything gets big and ugly and red and swollen. Eventually, that goes away. And this hematoma formation here, okay, is going to give way to become a mass of cells. But it's still soft, it hasn't hardened yet. This mass of cells here is called a soft callus. So that's the soft callus. The soft callus is where the cells that populate it change. Instead of all these angry immune cells and osteoclasts going in there, now it's going to start to build. It's going to start to bridge the gap. So in order to do that, you need cartilage cells to go in there. They're called chondrocytes. You need fibroblasts to go in there to make the collagen that's going to be used in the area. And they're all going to go in there. They're going to form a bump like you see in that picture. And it's a soft bump, and it's going to bridge the two ends of the bone together. In stage 3, the cartilage cells that are in there are going to start to form mineral. They're going to start to mineralize themselves, so that is going to change from a soft callus to what's called a hard callus. So you're going to have a hard bump, like a ball, around that fracture area. And this is also where you start to get a lot of the formation of blood vessels. So all those blood vessels you broke when you broke the bone are going to start to finally reform, reconnect to each other, or just grow new ones across the area. So that hard callus is very alive. It's going to stay there until everything is in place, and then you're going to move on to the next section, which is called remodeling. Remodeling is where the callus starts to fade and the bone starts to go back to the way it was before. So bone is the only tissue in the body that heals without a scar. So notice there's no scar here. There's nothing there. The bone that you get after you're done, it may take a long time, but the bone you get after you're done is the same as the bone that was there before. There's no scar. That's different than, let's say, skin. Time-wise, it depends on the kind of bone you broke, where that bone is, whether it's got a good blood supply or not, and your other general health. But in general, this first stage here, you're looking at a couple of weeks. The second stage here, you're probably looking at about another 4 to 6 weeks. And then this third stage here, you're looking at about 8 to 16 more weeks. And then finally, in the last stage, this can take years. Remodeling can go on for anywhere from 1 to 5 years after you've broken the bone. Or let's say you've just got your wisdom teeth removed and you have a hole in your jaw. I had all 4 of my wisdom teeth removed, and it takes a while for that bone to grow back in, fill up, and then remodel so it was just like it never happened. Now, primary bone healing is a lot more simpler. The secondary bone healing I went over first because it's more common, but it's also more complicated. Primary bone healing is easy. You have a fracture, but importantly, there's not really a gap there. The two ends of the bone are pushed very close together. They're touching. So in primary bone healing, if I zoom in, all that really happens is you get a line of osteoblasts on the edge of the bone from one side, and they just spit out osteoid underneath them, right in here, and they make their way across, and in front of them you have an osteoclast front there, and the osteoclasts go away. I mean, they come in and they start chewing up all the edges, clearing out all the debris, so that way the osteoblasts have a nice surface to ride on, and they just go across the gap from one side to the other, and the thing just zips right up. So the osteoblasts make bone, and they go right across this thing. That's it, it closes. That's all there is to it. So it's called tunneling across the fracture gap. It's depositing new bone as it goes, and it's also referred to as creeping substitution. Now, intramembranous bone healing only happens when there is no motion between the broken ends of the bones. When does that happen? If you have a cast on, there's motion between the ends of the bones. So casted bones, if you break your arm and you get a cast, that's going to go through secondary bone healing. You're going to get a callus. You're going to get that ball forming. The only time you usually see primary bone healing, there's actually 2 times, is when you use a rod or a plate or a screw or all of them to fix the bone in place so that the 2 ends are pressed tightly against one another and they are not moving. If that is the case, then you'll get this happening. If there's any motion between the 2, you're going to shift to secondary bone healing and you're going to get a callus. The other time you get primary bone healing, intramembranous bone healing, is when you put a scaffold. So if you do have a gap, between. If there was a gap here, instead of the bones being pushed tightly together, I can stick a piece of hard material in there. And if it's engineered correctly and the bone likes to grow on that material, it acts like a scaffold, like scaffolding around the building, right? And the bone will grow across that scaffold and connect to the other side, you hope. And that is also primary bone healing. You don't get a callus, you don't get a cartilage intermediary in scaffolds or in regular primary bone healing. Now, all of these scenarios are affected by your health and your habits. So things that can slow down bone healing and remodeling are smoking. If you're a smoker, you will heal much more slowly than someone that doesn't smoke. The same for diabetes. People who have diabetes, they have diabetic neuropathy, and their blood vessels don't really form very well. Their nerve tissue doesn't really register at the edges of their body, and they don't really respond well to wound healing. So if a diabetic breaks a bone, that bone is going to take much longer to heal. The entire system of growth factors that control bone healing, it goes much deeper than this, are just off in a diabetic. They're not working the same way. There's deficiencies there, and that is going to delay everything. So if you have a diabetic smoker, you're in even worse trouble. So do not break a bone if you're a diabetic smoker. Any other kind of vascular disease, any other kind of disease where you just don't have good blood vessels, for some reason there's something wrong with them, that's going to affect your bone healing. Same thing with metabolic disorders. There are disorders, genetic disorders, that affect directly how your body makes mineral. Some disorders make you have not enough mineral making capacity, and some give you too much mineral making capacity. That can happen, and that will definitely affect how fast you heal. It also happens with age. A baby breaking a bone will heal in less than half the time as an adult. I remember my daughter broke her arm once and was completely healed, even though it fractured completely through both the ulna and the radius. Within 10 weeks, you could almost not see anything on the x-ray. She was back to almost completely normal activity. That would have never been the case in an adult. If I broke a bone like that, I don't smoke, I don't have diabetes, but even with me, it would have taken twice as long as that. And then you add a diabetic smoker on top of that, there are chances there that it could never heal. There are also some situational things that affect bone healing. So the periosteum, that soft covering on the outside of the bone, is very integral in healing bone. If it's missing because, let's say, it got torn off in the accident, then your bone healing capacity is going to be greatly reduced. If you destroyed all your vasculature, maybe you don't have diabetes, but maybe the accident, heaven forbid, destroyed the vasculature in the area, now you've got other problems and you're going to delay the healing. You also have to understand that bone ends need to be pressed very tightly together if they're going to heal across that gap. If they're not, if you have too much space between the ends, especially more than a centimeter, then you could go to what's called a non-union. A non-union is when you form like a pseudo joint, a false joint in the area. The bone ends will never heal. That can also happen from not just too much space, but too much motion. If the bone ends are constantly being ground against one another and not given a chance to remain still and let the healing process take place, you could also get a non-union. Plating, although it can be very helpful if you put a bone plate over there to hold the two ends of the bone together, plating can also be harmful. If the plate harms the periosteum or the blood supply going into the bone, it can be detrimental. This is why plates are being designed now to not do that. And also certain kinds of medication you may be taking on the side, for instance, COX-2 inhibitors like Celebrex or Vioxx, they can inhibit bone formation. Certain antibiotics can be used to inhibit bone formation on purpose or by accident, like indomethacin, for example. So all these things contribute to how fast or if bone will heal. So that's going to end it. I hope you enjoyed this time learning about bone healing. We went over the functions of bone. We went over how bone is laid out, what kind of cell types live within it, and then we looked at bone healing for two different modes, primary and secondary. If you like this course and you want to see more, head over to medicaldevicecourses.com. Currently there's 4 courses over there, although I'm making more all the time. Right now they are medical device development, advanced medical device development, and 2 shorter courses about an hour long each on clinical research and European regulatory basics. Thank you very much.